Daf Yomi, Tractate Zevachim, page 86a, and starting from the bottom of 85b for context. Actually, we'll start from the Gemara. It's right at the bottom, last couple lines, last line or so. The Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan Hiktir Kohen es Hakol, Mizbechel, Rabos, Atzamos, Vagidim, V'akarnaim V'hatilafim. Telafim. The sages taught in the Braita, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar. Leviticus 1:9. The term "the whole" serves to include the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves among those items that are sacrificed on the altar. One might have thought that even if they separated from the flesh of the burnt offering, they are sacrificed upon the altar. Therefore, the verse states, "And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood," Deuteronomy 12:27, indicating that only those items and anything attached to them are sacrificed upon the altar. If one derives the halacha with regard to bones and tendons from the phrase "the flesh and the blood," and now we turn to 86a, which is our daf of the day. 86a, top of the page. Yachol yachalotz gidin v'atzamos v'yale basar legav mizbeach tavel hayom v'hektir ha'kohen ezekol. Okay, tzad mechubarin yalu Yehoshua afilu hein ve'rosh hamizbeach yerodu. Then one might have thought that a priest must first remove the tendons and bones from an offering and then sacrifice the flesh upon the altar. Therefore, the verse states, "And the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar, including the tendons and bones." How can these texts be reconciled? If they were attached to the flesh, they shall ascend. If they separated from the flesh, then even if they are already at the top of the altar, they shall descend. Man tanashams leidoma, Herr Shieldu, Rabbi, the Tanya big to the Kohen as a call with Mechem. The rabbis had some is Begid in a Kanaim to Lafaim. Afilu Perashu. The Gemara notes who is the Tana that you heard that says that if they separated, they shall descend. It is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. As it is taught in the Braita, and the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar. Leviticus 1:9. The term "the whole" serves to include the bones, and the tendons, and the horns, and the hooves among those items that are offered on the altar, even if they separated from the flesh of the offering. But if so, how do I realize the meaning of the verse, "And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood"? Deuteronomy 12:27, which indicates that only the flesh and blood of an offering descend upon the altar. This verse is necessary to tell you an additional halacha, that you return the consumed flesh of a burnt offering to the fire if it is dislodged from it, but you do not return the consumed tendons and bones if they are dislodged from the fire. Rabbi Omer, Kasu v'echad omer v'yiktir ha'kohen es hakol ha'mizbech ribo hakasu v'kasu echad omer v'asi soy l'secho הבשר ידם מיית אחר כיצד מחוברים יעלו הרשו אפילו הם בראש המזבח יעלו. The Braita continues. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says that verse 1 states, "And the priest shall make the whole smoke on the altar," which included tendons and bones. And one verse states, "And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood and the flesh and the blood, which excluded any part other than the flesh and the blood, how can these texts be reconciled? If they were attached to the flesh, they shall ascend. If they separated from the flesh, then, even if they are already on top of the altar, they shall descend. Perushu lo yalu, Omer Zera, lo yishanu, ela sheperushu klape mato, aval klape malo, kroivehu, te'akrivu likun, afilu perushu. The Mishnah teaches that items that are not meant for consumption on the altar, such as the bones and tendons, are sacrificed along with the flesh, if they are attached to it. But if they separated, they shall not ascend. Rabbi Zera said, the sages taught that if they separated from the flesh, they shall not ascend only when they separated from the offering downward, meaning away from the altar, whereby they became distant from the pyre when they were separated. But if they separated from the offering upward, meaning they became closer to the pyre when they were separated from the offering, they have to become closer to consumption and shall ascend. The Gemara asks, and even if they separated, shall they be offered? Doesn't the Mishnah state that they shall ascend only if they are still attached to the flesh? Rabbah said this. This is what Rabbi Zera is saying. It was necessary for the sages to teach the halacha that bones or tendons that separated from the flesh of an offering shall not ascend the altar only where they separated after the sprinkling of its blood, since at the time that the flesh itself became permitted for the altar through the sprinkling, the bones and tendons were still attached to the flesh and therefore fit to be offered with it. But if they separated from an offering before the sprinkling of its blood, they shall certainly not ascend, as they were already separated from the flesh when it became permitted for the altar. Instead, the sprinkling comes and permits them for any use, just as the hide of a burnt offering is permitted to the priests upon the sprinkling of its blood. In fact, one may even use such tendons or bones to fashion the handles of knives from them. Or atzmos, either one was in parentheses, one's in brackets. Atzmos is in parentheses, and atzmoseha is in brackets. Mutarin. The Gemara elaborates. Rabbah holds in accordance with that which Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. It is stated, he shall have the hide of the burnt offering that he has offered. Leviticus 7:8. With regard to a burnt offering, and it is stated, the priest that makes atonement, he shall have it. Leviticus 7:7. With regard to a guilt offering, the following verbal analogy is derived from here. Just as after the blood of a guilt offering is presented, its bones become permitted to the priest for any use, since only the portions intended for consumption on the altar are sacrificed, whereas the rest of the animal is given to the priests. So too, with regard to a burnt offering, bones that are not attached to the flesh and therefore not intended for the altar are permitted. Mufnei, dilo mufnei, ikal betrach. Mala shem shekin v'sarim mutalo, yeh yetira gativ. The Gemara notes the phrase "he shall leave" is free, meaning superfluous in its context, and therefore available for the purpose of establishing a verbal analogy, and there is a principle that such verbal analogies are not refuted. as if these words were not considered free. The verbal analogy can be refuted by saying, what is notable about a guilt offering? It is notable in that its meat is permitted and its bones are therefore permitted as well, while the flesh of a burnt offering ascends upon the altar in its entirety. If so, halachot may not be applied to one based on the other. Consequently, the phrase "he shall have" with regard to a burnt offering is considered as having been written superfluously, as it would have sufficed to state the height of the burnt offering that he has offered to the priest. Rav Ada bar Ahava raises an objection to the explanation of Rabbah from a Braita with regard to the bones of the sacrificial animals, specifically sin offerings or guilt offerings, which are offerings of the most sacred order, that are intended for consumption before the sprinkling of their blood. One who benefits from them is liable for misuse of consecrated property, similar to the halacha with regard to the flesh of offerings of the most sacred order before their blood is sprinkled. Liachas riko after the sprinkling of their blood, one who benefits from them is not liable for misuse of consecrated property, as they are not intended for sacrificing upon the altar. But concerning the bones of a burnt offering, one who benefits from them is always liable for misuse of consecrated property. This Braita contradicts the opinion of Rabbah, who said that if the bones are separated from a burnt offering before its sprinkling of blood, it is permitted to derive benefit from them. The Gemara answers say that the Braita meant the following: but concerning the bones of a burnt offering, if they separated before the sprinkling of its blood, and its blood was then sprinkled, then one who benefits from them is not liable for misuse of consecrated property. If they separated after the sprinkling of its blood, one who benefits from them is always liable for misuse of consecrated property. And Rabbah disagrees with Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, if the bones of a burnt offering separated from its flesh before sprinkling, one who benefits from them is liable for misuse of consecrated property. If they separated after sprinkling, the sages decreed that one may not benefit from them ab initio, but if one benefited from them after the fact, he's not liable for misuse, since by Torah law they were permitted through the sprinkling of the offering's blood. And now for the Mishnah. And now that's the end of the Talmud, and now we start a new Mishnah. Zog the Elige Mishnah. Chulam Shapaku. Me'al Gam Mizbeach Me'yagzil. V'chein Gachele Shipaka Me'al Gam Mizbeach Me'yagzil. Me'varim Shapaku Me'al Gabi Mizbeach Koidim Chatzois Yachzil Mo'al Mahen Liachal Chatzois Liachzil Yen Mo'al Mahen. And all of those disqualified offerings with regard to which it was taught, 84a, that if they ascended, they do not descend in the case where they were dislodged from the altar, the priest does not restore them to the altar. Likewise, with regard to an ember that was dislodged from upon the altar, the priest does not restore to the altar. As for limbs of a fit burnt offering that were dislodged from upon the altar, if they were dislodged before midnight, the priest should restore them to the altar, and one is liable for misusing them. But if they were dislodged after midnight, the priest does not restore them, and one is not liable for misusing them, as one is not liable for misuse of consecrated property after it has fulfilled the purpose for which it was designated. כשם שהמזבח מקדש את זרעו לו, כך הכבש מקדש. כשם שהמזבח והכבש מקדשים את זרעו להן, כך כן מקדשים. With regard to unfit items, that if they ascended, do not descend, just as the altar sanctifies items that are suited to it, so too the ramp sanctifies items that are suited to it. Just as the altar and the ramp sanctify items that are suited to them, so too the service vessels sanctify items that are placed in them. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now we start the Gemara. It says the Gemara, Hechidami, Idis Buhu Mamash. Afilu Achachasos Nami, Idiles Buhu Mamash. Afilu Kodem Chatzos Taminam Lo Tzricha. The Gemara says, the Mishnah teaches that limbs of a fit burnt offering that were dislodged from upon the altar before midnight are returned to the altar, but that if they were dislodged after midnight, they are not returned. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If the limbs have substance, meaning they were not yet consumed in their entirety by the fire, then even if they were dislodged after midnight, the priest must return them to the fire. If they do not have substance and have been reduced to ash, then even if they were dislodged before midnight, the priest does not return them to the altar. The Gemara answers, no, it is necessary. And now we're turning to the top of 86b. With regard to hardened limbs that were dried by the fire but have not yet been reduced to ash, the Mishnah teaches that before midnight such limbs should be returned to the altar. The Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived? That midnight determines whether or not they shall be returned. Okay, we'll stop here and continue with 86b after the break.